Well, last Sunday, I told you that I had been away at a pastor's retreat and that it was refreshing and I was challenged and I was encouraged. The thing is, before I went to the retreat, I was looking forward to a time of rest. I was looking forward to that opportunity to hear preaching rather than doing the preaching, to actually sit and hear someone preach and teach the Word of God to me. I was looking forward to getting away from the constant busyness of life and to just spend some quiet time with God. And this week, as I sat in my office, I was preparing in 1 John. And on Wednesday morning, I felt that God was leading me to share with you what he's been saying to me. Because to be open and vulnerable with you, over the last few years, there have been times when life has been a struggle. And I know that I'm not the only one who has felt that way. Many of us are tired or stressed or hurting, whether that's physically or emotionally. We may be asking why or now what. And sometimes we get no answers. And we find no solutions. But this is what I was reminded of, is that God is sovereign and good and kind. It's nothing new. I know it. In fact, I've stood right here and said those very same things to you many times before. But I needed to hear it again. God is sovereign and good and kind. He works through every situation for our good. And when we draw near to God, when we spend time with him just to be with him, it doesn't necessarily remove the hardships, but it fixes our perspective. It fixes how we see life. And when we see life through this right perspective, when we understand that God is good and kind and sovereign, we can rest in him. And when we rest in him, life is better. And it makes more sense. Even if you're experiencing hardship or carrying an unbearable burden or facing an impossible situation. And this is what we actually see in Joseph's life. Joseph experienced terrible trouble. And we also find that Joseph found rest in God's sovereignty and goodness. So we're going to look a little bit at Joseph's story this morning. So Joseph was born into a troubled situation. I mean, if you remember Joseph's story, his dad, Jacob, had 4 wives because his father-in-law deceived him. There's more to the story, but in general. And the first 2 wives, they were sisters, and there was a lot of jealousy and competition between them. And this situation resulted in the parents playing favorites. And so Joseph was his dad's favorite, and his dad gave him that special robe. But then this happened. Look at chapter 37, beginning in verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Did you get that? They hated him. Verse 6, he said to them, "Here is this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us?" It's interesting. They knew exactly what the dream meant, but they weren't buying it. Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So his dad didn't totally buy it either, but he kept it in mind. He said, there might be something to this. But his brothers were jealous of him and they hate him. And so even though he was the favorite, he was also an outcast in his own family, in his own home. Well, then the brothers go out to find pasture for their flocks, and they end up a good ways away from home. And so Jacob sends Joseph out to find his brothers and to see his brothers. So he goes to where his brothers, he thinks they're supposed to be. They've moved on, so he moves further and finds them. But as he's coming to them, they see him coming, and they say, "Oh, here comes the dreamer." They're still upset with him. They don't like him. And they plot against him. They decide to kill him. Well, Reuben, the oldest, says, "Don't kill him. Let's just throw him in this pit and decide what to do with him." Well, Reuben's plan was to come back and save him later. But while Reuben was away, the other brothers see some traveling traders, salesmen, coming through, and they decide to sell Jacob as a slave to those traders. Reuben comes back and says, "Where is he?" And now they have to cover it up. So they take his robe and they kill a goat and they put the goat's blood on the robe and they take it home and say, "Isn't this your son Joseph's robe?" And they let their father believe that Joseph has been killed by a wild animal. Well, then Joseph is taken away to Egypt, to a completely different country. And I think sometimes we don't really grasp the gravity of this. He wasn't just taken a couple counties away. He was taken to a completely different country. So at this point in his life, he has lost everything except his own life. Look at chapter 39 and beginning in verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. And so Joseph is sold as a slave. He is now just property. Someone owns him. But we read some good things, some things that sound promising here. I mean, he was bought by a prominent person in Egypt, so he seems kind of like a good situation. But remember, he's still a slave. And God makes Joseph successful. Now, this is good, and that he was bought by this prominent person and that he's successful. It's good only because we know that God is with him, and God is working through his situation. But it's still a bad situation. And it gets worse. If you know the story, Potiphar's wife comes in and comes on to Joseph and says, "Come lay down with me." And Joseph says no and runs away and leaves his robe. And then she takes it and says, "Look what this guy did. He came in here and he tried to take advantage of me." And Joseph is thrown in prison. And so to review so far, he's lost his family. He's taken far from everything he knows and everyone who loves him. He's lost his freedom. He's a slave. And just when some things seem positive, he's falsely accused of a crime and imprisoned. But then, now he's still in prison, but things seem to go in a positive direction. He's been put in charge of some things in the prison, and his job causes him to mingle with other important people. So Pharaoh's baker and Pharaoh's cupbearer are there in prison as well because he got upset with them. But they have some dreams. And Joseph interprets those dreams for them. And basically, their dreams are saying that in 3 days, the baker is going to be put to death and the cupbearer is going to be restored to his position. And what did Joseph say to the cupbearer when he told him that he would be restored? He said, "Remember me." In other words, put in a good word for me with Pharaoh. I don't belong here. Get me out of this place. Then look what happens. Chapter 40, verse 20, starting in verse 20. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer, and he restored him, and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Nothing seems to go right for Joseph. Every time it seems like it's going in the right direction, it turns around. It stays right where he's at. But then Pharaoh himself has a couple dreams that really upset him. And he knows that they mean something, but he doesn't know what. And so he's searching for the answer. His dream is basically that there were seven good-looking, healthy, strong, well-fed cows that came up from the Nile. And then 7 scrawny, emaciated cows come up and eat the healthy ones. That's unusual. You don't usually see a cow eat cows. But this is what happens in the dreams. It eats them. The healthy ones are gone. Then he dreams of 7 good, full, plump ears of corn. And then 7 terrible-looking, scrawny, dried-up corns grow up and eat the 8 good ones. Again, you don't see corn eating corn, but this is the dream. The good ones are gone. But no one can interpret his dreams for him. The cupbearer, at this point, remembers Joseph. He's like, "Oh yeah, I remember I was in prison and we had these dreams." And Joseph was able to interpret our dreams, and what he said is actually what happened. And so he tells Pharaoh, and Pharaoh brings Joseph in. Chapter 41, verse 28. "It is as I told Pharaoh," Joseph is speaking, "God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe." So all the good will be gone. Verse 32, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. And so Joseph interprets the dreams, but then he goes a step further and he actually decides, well, let me give you some advice too. So he gives them the advice. and tells him what he should do. You need to put someone in charge of all this and collect food and save it so that when people run out, there will be food. And Pharaoh says, well, who better to put in charge than Joseph, the guy who was able to interpret these dreams? Obviously, he's a wise man. And so Joseph is made second in command. Only Pharaoh is higher than Joseph. So then there's 7 good years of plenty, lots of produce grown. And Joseph saves up the food. And then there's 7 bad years. And in those bad years, people start running out of food. And so they start coming to Pharaoh, to Joseph, and buying food. Well, the thing is Joseph's family is back in Canaan. But there's a famine in Canaan as well. They're suffering the same famine. And they're running out of food. And they hear that there's food in Egypt. And so Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt to go get food for the family. And so they take this first trip down to Egypt. And when they get there, they don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes them. And when he recognizes them, he remembers his dreams. They are bowing before him. But at this point, he doesn't tell them who he is, but he tests them to see what their character is like. And after saying, okay, I'm going to give you food and all this, he keeps one of the brothers and he tells them to go, but next time you need to bring Benjamin back, their youngest brother. The brother who the dad would say, because I already lost Joseph. Benjamin was the second favorite. But look what happens in chapter 42, verse 21. Then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. Then he turned away from them and wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them. He took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags again. So he takes Simeon. He tells them, give them the food. And he also tells them, put their money in their bags. And when they stop for the night, they open the bags and they're like, oh, there's our money. And now they're even more in trouble. But it's interesting that when Joseph starts saying, you need to bring Benjamin and all this, what do they immediately think? They think back to what they have done to their brother. And they're like, oh, God is doing this. God is disciplining us. He's judging us for what we did. Another thing to notice in those verses, and I think sometimes we pass over these, because I think sometimes we read the story of Joseph, and we kind of sanitize it because we just think, oh, yeah, that was terrible. When the brothers sold him, we think, man, that was a terrible thing those brothers did. Do we think about the emotional state of Joseph? It says that he pleaded with them. He begged them not to do this. Joseph was in turmoil. He was just, you can imagine. What a horrible thing to happen to you. But now Joseph is standing here in front of his brothers. He's testing them and he's feeding them. He sends them away and sends them with their money. Well, eventually they run out of food again and they need to go back to Egypt. But they need to take Benjamin. So they go to their dad and they say, hey, we need to go back, but we've got to take, actually their dad says, go back. And they said, okay, but we got to take Benjamin. And he says, no way. Eventually, Judah steps up. Actually, look at chapter 43, beginning in verse 8. And Judah said to Israel, his father, send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would have now returned twice. He said, we could have gone and come back and 2 times. We need food. But Judah steps up here and says, I will be responsible. And this is actually when Judah and following the tribe of Judah took leadership in Israel. But he says, I will take care of it. So they come back to Egypt, and the brothers are brought to Joseph's home. And this scares them. Why would this guy bring us into his house? Well, then, the brothers are seated at the table. He said, don't worry about it. We're going to eat. And when they're in his house, they go to the servant and they say, by the way, our money that we paid was in the bags when we left. And he said, don't worry about it. Your God has blessed you. And they're like, okay. Then they're sat at the table, but they're sat down in birth order. Now that had to be completely unnerving. They're like looking at each other like, how did that happen? Long story short, Joseph ends up revealing himself to them. He says, it's me. It's Joseph. But they're afraid of him. See, because they know what they did. And they're afraid that now they're going to get what they deserve. And Joseph has the power to do it. But Joseph doesn't. He says, don't worry about it. And he tells them, bring your families down to Egypt, and I'll take care of you. So they do. They come down to Egypt, and they live there. And eventually, their dad, Jacob, dies. And at that point, the brothers are scared again. Because they think now Joseph is going to get even with us. Now that dad's dead, now he'll get even with us. Look at chapter 50 and verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of your servants, of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and for your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So his brothers think he'll kill them. And so they come up with a lie. And they basically say, Dad wanted you to go easy on us. And Joseph's like, that's not my plan. I mean, my plan isn't to hurt you. Why would I? It wasn't even in his mind. So the brothers think that he wants to kill them. But Joseph, he knows that God put him there not to kill them, but to save them. He says, I've saved many people, and that includes his family who had mistreated them. So Joseph had suffered the unimaginable. He had gone through terrible things. But he knows God. And he knows that God has worked through those extremely difficult times to do incredibly great, good things. Now, what was the difference between Joseph and his brothers? Joseph understood the sovereignty and goodness of God. He knew that God was in control, and he knew that God is good. Even in the midst of hardship, he understood that. He understood that even when people do evil things, God can work through it for good. He understood that God can work through the worst of situations for good. And because he understood that God is sovereign, that God is God, and that he's good, no matter what situation he found himself in, he was committed to be faithful to God. And he trusted God. Throughout his life, he leaned on God. Even though he suffered greatly, even though he didn't know what God was doing, he didn't understand why these things were happening, he knew God and he trusted God. And like Joseph, we can look at life through the lens of what we know about God and trust him as well. We can look at life through the lens of God's sovereignty and goodness and lean on him and be faithful. And we can see some great results. We may see some great results come out of our hardships, like Joseph did. Or we may not. But that doesn't change who God is. It doesn't change the fact that God is working in your life and through those situations. He is sovereign and he is good and he works through all things for good. Now, like I said, I know this. Everything we just said, I know this. But I have to confess, I don't always look at life through this lens. It's easy to fixate on the struggle or on the difficult situation that you're in rather than on God, on his sovereignty and goodness. So it's good to be reminded of these things. While I was at the retreat, I was reminded of this. It was refreshing and encouraging, like I said. My vision was corrected. I was looking at life through the lens of God's sovereignty and goodness. And then it only took 3 days. Wednesday morning, I woke up discouraged. I didn't wake up and start thinking about things. No, I woke up feeling discouraged. I felt like I was carrying a weight that I could do nothing about. And maybe that's true. Maybe there's nothing I could do about it. But that morning when I opened my Bible, Jesus called me out. I feel he kind of got in my face a little. I'm going to read for you the passage. Turn to Mark chapter 4. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, beginning in verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, Jesus is talking with his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The disciples were fixated on their situation, which is understandable. They were in danger. But they were freaking out. And they're like, "Jesus, don't you care?" And sometimes I can be just like them. I might pray and see nothing happen. And all I can see is the problem in front of me. And I feel like, Jesus, don't you care? But I love how Mark tells about Jesus calming the storm. It's like he's so calm and nonchalant. They come to Jesus, Jesus, don't you care? We're dying. And Jesus goes, huh? Oh. He stands up, stop. Everything stops. It's calm. Jesus can handle it. Whatever that storm is, he can handle it. Trust him. But then Jesus gets in their face a bit. Look at verse 40 again. What did he say? He said to them, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Now, I was reading in the Net Bible, and that translation reads it this way. Why are you so cowardly? And I read those words, and all I could say was, okay, you're right. Why are you cowardly? Do you still have no faith? I'm not seeing things right. That's exactly what I needed. And then there was another thing that stood out to me in this. In these verses in Mark 4 and then all of chapter 5, we see Jesus dealing with impossible situations. Not just hard situations, impossible situations. First, we have the storm. There was absolutely nothing the disciples could do. It was totally outside of their control. But it was easy for Jesus. And then in the following chapter, there's a man possessed by many demons. And he and the people who knew him could do nothing about it. And in fact, the people had chained him up even trying to control him. And he broke the chains. There was nothing they could do. It was totally and completely out of their control. But Jesus handled it. And then there was a woman who had been bleeding for years. And the doctors could do nothing for her. In fact, they made it worse. But Jesus healed her. And then there's Jairus' daughter. She was sick, and they came and asked Jesus to come see her and to heal her. But while he was delayed because of the woman who was bleeding, the daughter died. And the people came back and they said, don't bother Jesus because it's too late. She's already died. There's nothing we can do about it now. And Jesus' response was very simple. He said, just believe. And then he went and he raised her from the dead. Just trust God. Keep your eyes on Jesus. There is nothing too hard for Jesus. There is nothing out of his control. Oh, it definitely may be out of our control, but not his. And maybe, like me, maybe you need Jesus to get in your face too. Are you fixated on your troubles? Are you looking at Jesus? Jesus calls us to have faith, to trust God, to look at life and your current situation through the lens of God's sovereignty and goodness. He's strong. He's in control. He's good. And he's working in your life. But how do we get there? How do we keep this right perspective? How do we keep trusting him and remain faithful to him? There's only one way. You've got to know him and be close to him. You've got to spend time with him. Just to be near him. Just to sit at his feet. And it can be easy for us to get our eyes stuck on our situation or on ourselves. Even when we're praying, even when we're worshiping, we're stuck looking at ourselves. Sometimes people go to worship just for what they will get out of it. But our worship is about God, not about me. It's about God. And some people worship, and I put that in quotes because I don't know if this is even true worship. But some people worship just looking for a feeling or experience. But we worship because it's right. We worship because God deserves it. He's worthy of it. Don't get me wrong. Do we benefit when we worship? Absolutely. But worship is not about me. It's about him. It's about God. So spend time focusing on him and giving him the praise that only he is worthy of. And sometimes we read the Bible just looking for an answer. Or maybe looking for that nugget that's going to get you through the day or through the week. And sometimes we're disappointed because we didn't find that great thing that jumped out at us. Now imagine talking to your spouse for an hour and then saying to your spouse, "You said nothing amazing. We've been talking for an hour. You've said nothing that I can take and post on social media." That's not why you talk, right? I mean, you talk because you have a relationship and you're building that relationship. Maybe we need to open the Bible and read it to simply spend time with God. Just to be with him, to hear from him. And sometimes people pray only to ask for things, ask God for things. Think of any other relationship you have. If all you ever did was ask that person for things, that wouldn't be much of a relationship, would it? When's the last time you talked to God just to spend time with him? Well, let's read one last passage today. It's a psalm, Psalm 25. It's a psalm of David, and it ties in together a lot of what we've talked about this morning. Psalm 25. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. In other words, I open to you, I worship you, I praise you. O my God, in you I trust. Let me not be put to shame. Let my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none who wait for you shall be put to shame. They shall be ashamed who are wantonly treacherous, or empty treachery. Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me. For you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all day long. Remember your mercy, O Lord, and your steadfast love, for they have been from old. Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me, for the sake of your goodness, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. The paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. Who is the man who fears the Lord, or who worships the God, who knows God, who believes in God, who honors God? Who is the man who fears the Lord? Him will he instruct in the way that he should choose. His soul shall abide in well-being, and his offspring shall inherit the land. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he makes known to them his covenant. My eyes are ever toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distresses. Consider my affliction and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Consider how many are my foes, and with what violent hatred they hate me. O guard my soul and deliver me. Let not me be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. May integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. Redeem Israel, O God, out of his troubles. I just want to make a couple points from these verses. Look again at verse 1 and 2 again. He says, to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. Oh my God, in you I trust. I think usually when I read this verse, the emphasis in my mind falls on the I lift up my soul, or I trust. And when I read this recently, what jumped out to me is the you. It's you. God, it's you who I worship. It's you who I trust. You are my God. It's God that we look to, that we hold to in troubled times. He is God. He's my God. And I can trust him. And David is clear as he goes through this psalm that Yahweh, the Lord, is the God of my salvation. It's not anyone else. It's not himself. But God is the God of his salvation. And he's waiting on God all day long. He knows God is sovereign, and he knows he's good. And so he looks to God and trusts God. And the second thing, as we read this, we see that David is in trouble of some sort. He's lonely, he's afflicted, but this psalm, this song or prayer, is almost all about God. He's not really looking at himself here, he's looking at God. He talks about God's steadfast love and goodness, that God is good and upright, that God leads and teaches, that God is faithful. And even when David makes a request here, it comes back to God. He says, forgive me for your sake. Do this for your name's sake. You see, this psalm is all about relationship with God. Knowing him and his ways and honoring him in worship and in life and having friendship or being close, a close relationship with God. And because of that relationship, David trusts God. Look at verse 14 and 15 again. He says, the friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him. Those who worship him, those who recognize who he is, those who adore him, those who revere him. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he makes known to them his covenant. My eyes are ever toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. David is saying, you know what? Why do I always look to God? Because he's the one that can save me. If I'm trapped in this situation, God's in control. When we have a close relationship with God, we trust him and we find rest in him. Just in closing, let me repeat what I said at the beginning this morning. God is sovereign and good and kind. He works through every situation for our good. And when we draw near to God, when we spend time with him just to be with him, it doesn't remove the hardship, but it fixes our perspective. It fixes how we see life. And when we see life through this right perspective, when we understand that God is good and kind and sovereign, we can rest in him. And when we rest in him, life is better. And it makes more sense. Even if you're experiencing hardship or carrying an unbearable burden or facing an impossible situation. May we fix our eyes on Jesus, not on our situation. And may we look at life through the lens of God's sovereignty and goodness and find rest in our good and gracious God.